The silk sheets felt cold against my skin as I stared at the ceiling of our master bedroom, listening to the sound of running water from the ensuite bathroom. 3 years, 1,095 days of marriage, and my husband had never once touched me. Not really. Not the way a husband should touch his wife. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Madison Hartwell, or Madison Sterling, now I reminded myself bitterly, had always believed that love would find its way. Growing up in a modest apartment above her mother's flower shop in Portland, she'd dreamed of fairy tale romances and passionate love stories. She never imagined she'd end up in a marriage that felt more like an elaborate business arrangement. The Sterling mansion loomed before her every evening as she returned from her job at the downtown marketing firm, its imposing Georgian columns and manicured gardens a stark reminder of the world she'd married into. 3 years ago, she'd been swept off her feet by Alexander Sterling, heir to the Sterling tech empire, a man whose piercing blue eyes and devastating smile had made her believe in love at first sight. Their whirlwind courtship had lasted only 6 months. Alexander had been attentive, charming, the perfect gentleman who brought her flowers and took her to expensive restaurants she'd only dreamed of entering. He'd proposed during a sunset dinner overlooking the Pacific, slipping a 5-carat diamond ring onto her trembling finger while promising her a lifetime of happiness. But the moment they'd exchanged vows at the lavish ceremony, attended by Portland's elite and covered by society magazines, everything changed. Madison pulled her robe tighter around her body as she descended the spiral staircase, her bare feet silent on the marble steps. The mansion felt more like a museum than a home, with its pristine white walls adorned with expensive artwork and furniture that looked like it belonged in a showroom rather than a place where people actually lived. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." Maria, their longtime housekeeper, greeted her warmly. The middle-aged woman with kind eyes had become Madison's only real confidante in this cold house. "Morning, Maria. Has Alexander left for the office already?" "Yes, ma'am. He had an early meeting with the board of directors. He mentioned he might be working late again tonight." Madison nodded, trying to hide her relief. Another evening alone, another night sleeping in their king-sized bed while Alexander retreated to his study, claiming he had important calls to make with international clients. The time difference, he always said. Business never slept in the tech world. At Sterling Tech's downtown headquarters, Alexander commanded respect from every corner office to the mailroom. At 32, he'd taken the company his grandfather founded and transformed it into a global powerhouse, specializing in cybersecurity software that protected major corporations worldwide. His sharp intellect and ruthless business acumen had earned him features on magazine covers and invitations to speak at international conferences. But at home, he was a ghost. Madison had stopped trying to understand when the distance had begun. Was it their wedding night, when he'd claimed exhaustion from the ceremony and slept in the guest room? Or perhaps the week-long honeymoon in the Maldives, where he'd spent most of his time on conference calls while she lounged alone by their private pool? The signs had been there from the beginning, but she'd been too blinded by love, or what she'd thought was love, to see them. Their daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Alexander left for work before she woke up, returned after she'd already had dinner, and disappeared into his study until well past midnight. They shared breakfast on weekends, stilted conversations about work and weather while sitting at opposite ends of their dining table that could seat 12. At social functions, they played their parts perfectly. Alexander would place his hand on the small of her back, lean in to whisper what appeared to be sweet nothings but were usually reminders about upcoming charity galas or business dinners they needed to attend. Madison had become an expert at smiling graciously while her heart slowly withered away. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, it was the questions. The subtle inquiries from Alexander's mother, Catherine Sterling, about when they might expect grandchildren, the knowing looks from society wives, who seemed to sense something was amiss. The way Alexander's business associates would compliment him on his lovely wife, while he nodded politely but never met her eyes. Madison had tried everything. She'd bought expensive lingerie that remained unworn in her dresser drawer. She'd planned romantic dinners that he'd missed due to urgent business matters. She'd suggested couples therapy, only to be told that their marriage was fine and she was being overly dramatic. The breaking point had come 6 months ago during a charity auction for children's education, a cause close to Madison's heart since she'd grown up struggling financially. She'd bid on a weekend getaway to Napa Valley, hoping it might give them a chance to reconnect. Alexander had been furious, not because of the money, the $10,000 was pocket change to him, but because she'd made the bid without consulting him first. "You embarrassed me tonight, Madison," he'd said coldly during the silent drive home. "My wife doesn't make public spectacles. I was trying to support a good cause. I thought we could use some time away together. I don't have time for romantic getaways. Some of us have real responsibilities." That night she'd cried herself to sleep, while Alexander worked in his study until dawn. Now as she sat in her modern kitchen, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that looked like they'd never been used for actual cooking, Madison found herself questioning everything. Had she married a man who simply didn't desire her? Was there something fundamentally wrong with her that made her own husband recoil from her touch? She'd confided in her best friend Emma during their monthly coffee dates, but how could she explain that her marriage to one of Portland's most eligible bachelors was essentially celibate? That she was 28 years old and still a virgin because her husband of 3 years had never shown the slightest interest in physical intimacy? "Maybe he's just really focused on work right now," Emma had suggested, but even she'd sounded doubtful. Some men compartmentalize differently. Madison knew it was more than that. There was something deliberate about Alexander's avoidance, something calculated about the way he ensured they were never truly alone together. Even their brief kisses at public events felt rehearsed, performed for an audience rather than born from genuine affection. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Alexander's office number. "Madison, I won't be home for dinner tonight. The Singapore deal requires some last-minute adjustments." "Of course," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Will you be very late?" "Probably not until after midnight. Don't wait up." The line went dead before she could respond. Madison set the phone down and stared at the diamond ring on her finger, the symbol of promises that had never been kept and dreams that had slowly turned to dust. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Madison Sterling would finally discover the truth about her marriage, and nothing would ever be the same again. The mansion settled into its familiar evening quiet as Madison prepared for another solitary night, unaware that the phone call she would accidentally overhear in just a few hours would shatter every illusion she'd built about her life, her marriage, and the man she'd thought she loved. Madison had fallen asleep on the living room couch while reading, a glass of wine half empty on the coffee table beside her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11:30 when she stirred, her neck stiff from the awkward position. The house remained dark except for the soft glow emanating from Alexander's study down the hall. He was home. She hadn't heard him come in, which wasn't unusual. Alexander moved through their house like a shadow, careful not to disturb the fragile peace they'd constructed around their separate lives. Madison debated whether to go upstairs to bed or check if he needed anything, playing the role of the dutiful wife she'd somehow become. As she approached the study, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, something that never happened. Alexander was meticulous about his privacy, always ensuring his business conversations remained confidential. The warm light spilled into the hallway, and she could hear his voice, low and intense. Madison paused, her hand reaching for the door to announce her presence, when she heard something that made her blood freeze. "I can't keep doing this much longer, Victoria. It's been 3 years. Victoria." Madison's heart hammered against her ribcage. She'd never heard Alexander mention anyone by that name, and there was something in his tone intimate, familiar, that she'd never heard him use with her. "I know what we agreed, but she's starting to ask questions. She hired that private investigator last month, didn't she?" Private investigator. Madison pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She'd never hired anyone. What was he talking about? "No, I handled it. My contact at the firm made sure the investigation went nowhere." Alexander's voice carried a coldness that sent chills down Madison's spine. "But we can't keep her in the dark forever. She's not stupid, despite what your father thinks." "Your father?" Madison's knees nearly gave out. Victoria's father. Who was this woman? And why was Alexander discussing her, his wife, with someone else's daughter? "The contract is ironclad, but there are complications we didn't anticipate." Alexander sighed heavily. "She's developed feelings, real ones. It's becoming a problem." Madison's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. "Contract? What contract? Of course I don't feel anything for her," Alexander continued, his words like knives through Madison's chest. "This was always business, Victoria. You know that. Your father's pharmaceutical patents combined with Sterling Tech's distribution network, it's worth billions. But the marriage clause in his will was non-negotiable." The room seemed to spin around Madison. marriage clause, will. Nothing Alexander was saying made sense, yet every word felt like another piece of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. She has no idea about Hartwell Pharmaceuticals being connected to Sterling Industries. Her mother never told her that her late father's company was absorbed into your father's portfolio 15 years ago. She thinks she married me for love. Madison's father, the father she'd never known, who died when she was 5. Her mother had always been vague about his work, saying only that he'd been a researcher who died in a car accident. But Alexander was talking about him like he'd been someone important, someone whose work was worth billions. The irony is perfect, isn't it? Alexander's laugh was bitter. She fell in love with the son of the man who destroyed her father's legacy. If she knew Richard Hartwell had discovered the cure for ALS before his death, and that her precious husband's family has been suppressing it for decades, Madison's legs gave out completely. She slid down the wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her father, the father she'd never known, had found a cure for ALS. And the Sterling family had what? Hidden it, stolen it. Victoria, I don't care about your jealousy right now. We have bigger problems. Madison's been volunteering at the ALS Research Center downtown. She's asking questions about funding, about why certain research lines got discontinued in the late 90s. If she starts digging into the right records. The ALS Center. Madison had started volunteering there 6 months ago, drawn by a desire to help after meeting a young mother diagnosed with the disease at a charity event. She'd been curious about the research gaps, the promising studies that seemed to vanish without explanation. No, killing her isn't an option, Alexander snapped, and Madison's blood turned to ice. Despite what you think, I'm not a monster. Besides, her death would trigger investigations we can't afford. The inheritance clause requires her to live to 30 for the patents to transfer completely to Sterling Industries. We only have 2 more years. 30. Madison would turn 30 in exactly 24 months. And then what? What happened to her after the patents transferred? I've been thinking about alternatives. Perhaps an accident that leaves her incapacitated. Memory loss would be ideal. She'd be alive to satisfy the legal requirements but unable to cause problems. Madison's vision blurred with tears and terror. The man she'd married, the man she'd loved, was calmly discussing erasing her memory to steal her father's legacy. The divorce option won't work. Her father's will specifically requires her to remain married to maintain his pharmaceutical holdings. Richard Hartwell was paranoid about corporate takeovers. He structured everything to protect his research through his daughter's marriage. Her father had tried to protect her, even from beyond the grave. Richard Hartwell had attempted to ensure his daughter would be safe and his life's work would be preserved. But somehow, the Sterling family had manipulated the situation to their advantage. Victoria, I don't want to discuss our personal situation right now. Yes, once this is over, we can be together properly. But until then, I need you to trust me. Madison heard movement in the study and panic shot through her. If Alexander found her here, if he knew she'd overheard, she scrambled to her feet and ran as quietly as possible toward the staircase, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give her away. Behind her, she heard Alexander's voice continuing the conversation, oblivious to her presence. In the safety of their bedroom, though nothing felt safe anymore, Madison locked the door and collapsed onto the bed. Her entire life had been a lie. Her marriage, her husband's kindness during their courtship, even her father's death. Everything had been orchestrated by the Sterling family. The man sleeping in the bed next to her every night had been planning to erase her memory, or worse. Madison stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through 3 years of memories, seeing them now through a completely different lens. Alexander's reluctance to be intimate wasn't about work stress or personality differences. It was because he didn't love her, had never loved her. She was nothing more than a business transaction to him. But she was also something he hadn't counted on. Richard Hartwell's daughter, with her father's intelligence and determination. And now she knew the truth. The question was, what was she going to do about it? As the grandfather clock chimed midnight, Madison Sterling began planning the most important performance of her life. Tomorrow, she would wake up and pretend to be the naive, lovesick wife Alexander believed her to be. But secretly, she would begin investigating her father's legacy, uncovering the truth about his research, and finding a way to expose the Sterling family's crimes. She had 2 years before her 30th birthday. 2 years to turn the tables on the people who had stolen her father's life's work and destroyed any chance of saving countless lives. 2 years to make them pay for what they'd done. The game had changed, but Madison Sterling was just getting started. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland buzzed with activity as media crews positioned their cameras and reporters jockeyed for the best angles. Madison Sterling, soon to be Madison Hartwell again, walked up the marble steps flanked by her legal team, her head held high despite the chaos surrounding her. Today marked the culmination of 18 months of investigation, legal battles, and personal transformation that had shaken Portland's elite to its core. The Sterling Industries scandal had dominated headlines for weeks. Pharmaceutical heiress exposes decades-long conspiracy, read the morning's Oregonian. ALS cure suppressed for profit blazed across the New York Times business section. But for Madison, this wasn't about headlines or public vindication. It was about honoring her father's legacy and ensuring that his life-saving research would finally see the light of day. Inside the courtroom, Alexander Sterling sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence diminished by orange prison attire and shackles. The man who had controlled every aspect of Madison's life for 3 years now avoided her gaze, his lawyers whispering frantically as they prepared for what everyone knew would be a devastating sentencing hearing. Judge Patricia Reeves, a no-nonsense federal judge known for her harsh sentences in white-collar crime cases, reviewed the extensive case file one final time. The charges were staggering: conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of intellectual property, suppression of life-saving medical research, attempted kidnapping, and a dozen other federal crimes that could result in life imprisonment. Your Honor, began Prosecutor Daniel Chen, rising to address the court, the evidence presented over these past months reveals a conspiracy so callous, so deliberately harmful to human welfare, that it defies comprehension. The defendants didn't merely steal Dr. Richard Hartwell's research, they weaponized it, suppressing a cure for ALS, while simultaneously developing treatments that would generate billions in ongoing revenue rather than actually curing the disease. Madison watched as the prosecutor outlined the full scope of the Sterling family's crimes. The evidence she had painstakingly gathered, with help from Dr. Sarah Martinez, investigative journalist Marcus Webb, and a network of whistleblowers within Sterling Industries, painted a picture of corporate evil that had shocked even seasoned federal investigators. The scheme had been masterful in its complexity. After arranging Richard Hartwell's death in 1998, disguised as a car accident but actually a carefully planned murder, the Sterling family had gradually acquired Hartwell Pharmaceuticals through a series of shell companies and legal maneuvers. They had then systematically buried his ALS research while developing inferior treatments that would require lifelong administration, generating massive profits from patients who could have been cured. The marriage arrangement, Prosecutor Chen continued, was the final piece of their scheme. By manipulating Ms. Hartwell into marrying Alexander Sterling, they gained legal control over the remaining patents and research that would have exposed their crimes. They literally married their victim's daughter to steal her inheritance and silence the truth. Victoria Blackwood sat in the gallery, having already been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. Her father, pharmaceutical mogul Robert Blackwood, had received 25 years for orchestrating the murder of Richard Hartwell and the subsequent cover-up. The sight of the woman who had helped plan Madison's psychological torture filled her with a cold satisfaction. But it was Alexander's mother, Catherine Sterling, who had provided the most damning testimony. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of dying in prison, the Sterling matriarch had agreed to cooperate fully with federal investigators. Her detailed confession had revealed decades of corporate murder, theft, and conspiracy that went far beyond even Madison's worst suspicions. Ms. Hartwell, Judge Reeves addressed Madison directly, "You have chosen to address the court before sentencing. Please proceed." Madison rose slowly, feeling the weight of her father's memory and the hopes of countless ALS patients who had died while his cure remained hidden. She had spent weeks preparing these words, but now, facing the man who had stolen 3 years of her life and decades of her father's legacy, the speech felt inadequate. "Your Honor, I stand before you not seeking revenge but justice. My father, Dr. Richard Hartwell, devoted his life to finding a cure for ALS because he believed that every human life had value. He believed that scientific discovery should serve humanity, not corporate profits. The defendants stole more than patents and research. They stole hope from millions of families facing this devastating disease. Madison's voice strengthened as she continued. For 3 years, I lived as a prisoner in my own marriage, believing I was unloved and unwanted, never knowing that my husband was simply waiting for the right moment to destroy me completely. I was manipulated, gaslighted, and ultimately marked for elimination, all to protect a conspiracy built on my father's grave. She turned to face Alexander directly for the first time since the trial began. You made me feel worthless, Alexander. You made me question my own reality and my own worth as a human being. But in trying to break me, you gave me something far more valuable than you intended. You gave me the truth, and the truth has set me free. Alexander's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he mouthed, "I'm sorry." But Madison had moved beyond the reach of his manipulations. She had found her strength in her father's legacy and her own resilience. Most importantly, Madison concluded, "I want the court to know that my father's research will be released immediately upon sentencing. The Hartwell Foundation, which I am establishing with the recovered assets from Sterling Industries, will ensure that his ALS treatment is available to every patient who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay. His work will finally serve the purpose he intended, saving lives, not taking them." The courtroom fell silent as Madison returned to her seat. Even the hardened reporters seemed moved by her quiet dignity and determination to transform personal tragedy into public good. Judge Reeves spent several minutes reviewing the sentencing guidelines before addressing the defendants. "In 30 years on the federal bench, I have rarely encountered crimes of such calculated cruelty and far-reaching harm. The defendants didn't merely commit corporate fraud, they orchestrated a conspiracy that cost thousands of lives and destroyed families across multiple generations." Alexander Sterling received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The supporting players in the conspiracy received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years. The Sterling Industries assets, valued at over $8 billion, were transferred to the Hartwell Foundation for medical research and victim compensation. 3 months later, Madison stood in the state-of-the-art research facility that bore her father's name, watching as the first patients received the ALS treatment he had developed over 25 years ago. Dr. Sarah Martinez had agreed to serve as the Foundation's chief medical officer, ensuring that Richard Hartwell's research would be conducted with the highest ethical standards. "The preliminary results are even better than we hoped," Dr. Martinez reported, reviewing the latest patient data. "We're seeing significant improvement in motor function within weeks of beginning treatment. Some patients who were told they had months to live are now planning family vacations." Madison smiled, imagining her father's joy at seeing his work finally helping people. The foundation had also uncovered 3 other suppressed treatments for various diseases, stolen by Sterling Industries over the years. Each would be developed and released to the public at cost, ensuring that corporate greed could never again stand between patients and life-saving medicine. Her personal transformation had been as dramatic as her public vindication. The shy, uncertain woman who had lived in fear of her husband's disapproval had evolved into a confident advocate for medical transparency and corporate accountability. She had testified before Congress about pharmaceutical industry practices, spoken at medical conferences worldwide, and become a voice for victims of corporate abuse. The marriage to Alexander had been annulled rather than divorced, the court ruling that the entire arrangement had been based on fraud and coercion. Madison had legally reclaimed her father's name and with it his legacy of service to humanity. But perhaps the most significant change was personal. Dr. James Morrison, a brilliant researcher she had met while establishing the foundation, had become much more than a professional colleague. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Everything her marriage to Alexander had lacked. "Madison," James said, approaching her in the foundation's main laboratory, "the patient from yesterday wants to thank you personally. She's the young mother with 2 small children, the one who was told she had 6 months to live." Madison followed him to the patient consultation room, where Maria Santos waited with her husband and twin 5-year-old daughters. Just 2 months earlier, Maria had been confined to a wheelchair, her voice barely audible as the disease ravaged her motor neurons. Now she stood to greet Madison, her voice clear and strong. "Mrs. Hartwell, I don't know how to thank you," Maria said, embracing Madison warmly. "My girls will grow up with their mother because of your father's work and your courage to fight for the truth." These moments made every day of the legal battle worthwhile. Madison had transformed personal trauma into purposeful action, ensuring that her father's legacy would live on in every life saved by his research. As evening fell over Portland, Madison stood on the foundation building's rooftop garden, looking out over the city where her journey had begun. The lights twinkled below like stars, each one representing a life that might be touched by her father's work. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dinner tomorrow? I have something important to ask you." Madison smiled, recognizing the nervous excitement in his message. After years of manipulation and emotional abuse, she had learned to trust again, to love again, and most importantly, to value herself again. The virginity that had once symbolized her husband's rejection now represented her freedom to choose her own path. At 31, Madison Hartwell was finally living the life her father would have wanted for her, one dedicated to service, truth, and genuine human connection. The Sterling Industries building across the city stood empty, its corporate logo removed, and its assets redistributed to the victims of decades of corporate crime. Justice had been served, but more importantly, justice was continuing to be served every day through the Foundation's work. Madison Hartwell had discovered that the most powerful revenge against those who tried to destroy her was simply living well and using her survival to ensure that others would have the chance to live at all. As she headed home to her modest apartment, a far cry from the Sterling mansion but infinitely more comfortable, Madison carried with her the knowledge that she had honored her father's memory and transformed his stolen legacy into a living monument to human compassion. The game that had begun with her birth and continued through her marriage was finally over. And Madison Hartwell had won, not just for herself, but for every patient who would benefit from her father's cure, every family who would be spared the devastation of ALS, and every person who believed that truth and justice could still triumph over greed and corruption. Her story had started with a lie, 3 years married and still a virgin because her husband never loved her. But it ended with the truth. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all, but about learning to love yourself enough to fight for what's right no matter the cost. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and purpose, and for the first time in her life, Madison Hartwell was truly free to embrace it. 6 months after the sentencing, Madison found herself in Geneva, Switzerland, addressing the World Health Organization's annual assembly. The same woman who had once trembled at the thought of contradicting her husband now commanded the attention of global health leaders, pharmaceutical executives, and patient advocacy groups from around the world. The Hartwell Protocol has now been implemented in 43 countries, Madison announced to the packed auditorium. We've treated over 12,000 ALS patients with a 96% success rate in halting disease progression and an 84% rate of significant motor function improvement. But more importantly, we've proven that life-saving medical research belongs to humanity, not to corporate shareholders. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just applause, it was recognition of a fundamental shift in how the world viewed pharmaceutical ethics. The Hartwell Foundation had become a model for open-source medical research, sharing discoveries freely and ensuring that breakthrough treatments reached patients regardless of geography or economic status. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the WHO's Director General, approached Madison after her presentation. "Your foundation's work has inspired legislative changes in dozens of countries. The Hartwell Transparency Act is being debated in the U.S. Congress as we speak. You've created a legacy that extends far beyond your father's original research." Back in Portland, the ripple effects of Madison's courage continued to expand. The law firm that had helped Alexander hide his crimes had been disbanded, its partners facing criminal charges and disbarment proceedings. The private investigators who had stalked Madison during her marriage were serving prison sentences for harassment and invasion of privacy. Even the society magazines that had celebrated the Sterling family's wealth and influence now ran exposés about their criminal empire. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the transformation of the Sterling mansion itself. Madison had donated the property to Portland State University, which converted it into a research center for genetic diseases. The same rooms where she had lived in isolation and fear now bustled with graduate students and researchers working to cure conditions that had plagued humanity for generations. Emma Caldwell, Madison's best friend, who had witnessed her suffering during the dark years of her marriage, now served as the Foundation's Director of Patient Services. "You know what amazes me most?" Emma said as they walked through the bustling research center that had once been Madison's prison. "You've taken every single weapon they used against you and turned it into something that helps people. Your isolation became your strength. Their lies became your motivation to seek truth. Even your pain became your empathy for other victims." The Hartwell Foundation had indeed become more than a medical research organization. It was a sanctuary for corporate whistleblowers, a legal resource for victims of pharmaceutical fraud, and a beacon of hope for patients abandoned by profit-driven healthcare systems. Madison had assembled a team of former Sterling Industries employees who had been silenced or fired for trying to expose the company's crimes. Their insider knowledge had proven invaluable in identifying other suppressed treatments and bringing additional corporate criminals to justice. Dr. Michael Chen, a former Sterling researcher who had been blacklisted for questioning the company's research priorities, now led the Foundation's neurology division. "Working here feels like redemption," he told Madison during their weekly team meeting. "For 15 years, I watched promising treatments get buried because they weren't profitable enough. Now we're not just releasing your father's ALS cure. We're developing treatments for Huntington's disease, multiple sclerosis, and early-onset Alzheimer's that Sterling suppressed." The Foundation's work had attracted international attention from other victims of corporate medical fraud. Families from around the world contacted Madison's team, sharing stories of loved ones who had died while pharmaceutical companies sat on potential cures. Each case was investigated thoroughly, and several had resulted in additional criminal prosecutions and recovered treatments. Madison's relationship with James had deepened into something she had never believed possible, a partnership built on complete honesty, mutual respect, and shared purpose. Unlike her marriage to Alexander, which had been based on manipulation and hidden agendas, her relationship with James flourished in the light of truth and transparency. "I have something for you," James said one evening as they walked through the Foundation's memorial garden, where plaques honored the thousands of ALS patients who had died while the Sterling family hoarded the cure. He dropped to one knee, producing a simple but elegant ring. "Madison Hartwell, will you marry me? Not for business arrangements or family politics or corporate mergers, but because I love you exactly as you are, and I want to spend my life supporting your incredible work." The proposal was everything her first engagement had not been: genuine, voluntary, and born from love rather than manipulation. "Yes," Madison whispered, tears streaming down her face, "but only if you understand that my work will always come first. These patients, this mission, it's bigger than both of us. That's exactly why I love you." James replied, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Your compassion, your determination to fight for people who can't fight for themselves, that's what makes you extraordinary." Their wedding, held in the Foundation's main laboratory surrounded by the research equipment that was saving lives daily, was attended by patients, researchers, and advocacy groups from around the world. Dr. Martinez officiated the ceremony, having been ordained specifically for the occasion. Maria Santos, the young mother whose life had been saved by the ALS treatment, served as Madison's maid of honor. The ceremony was live-streamed to ALS support groups globally, with many patients participating virtually from their hospital beds or treatment centers. Instead of wedding gifts, guests were encouraged to donate to the Foundation's research fund or to volunteer for patient advocacy programs. "Today we're not just celebrating a marriage," Madison said in her wedding speech. "We're celebrating the triumph of love over greed, truth over deception, and hope over despair. My father's research has given Maria and thousands of other patients the chance to see their children grow up. That's the greatest wedding gift any couple could ask for." The Foundation's impact continued to grow exponentially. The Hartwell model, open-source medical research with patient welfare as the primary priority, was being adopted by universities and research institutions worldwide. Madison had been invited to establish similar foundations in London, Tokyo, and São Paulo, creating a global network of ethical medical research organizations. But success hasn't come without challenges. Corporate interests threatened by the Foundation's transparency fought back through lobbying efforts, frivolous lawsuits, and attempts to discredit Madison's work. Death threats arrived regularly, forcing her to accept security protection that reminded her uncomfortably of her days as a Sterling wife under surveillance. "They're desperate," explained FBI agent Rachel Torres, who led the task force investigating threats against the Foundation. "Your work threatens billions of dollars in pharmaceutical profits. The companies that can't compete with free, effective treatments are getting increasingly aggressive in their attempts to shut you down." Madison refused to be intimidated. "My father died protecting his research. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by backing down because some corporate executives are angry about losing their blood money." The Foundation's legal team, led by prosecutor Daniel Chen, who had left government service to join their cause, worked tirelessly to defend against corporate attacks while continuing to investigate pharmaceutical fraud. Their efforts had resulted in the recovery of treatments for diabetes, heart disease, and several forms of cancer that had been suppressed by various companies over the decades. As Madison approached her second wedding anniversary with James, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from a terrified, isolated wife to a globally recognized advocate for medical justice. The scared young woman who had overheard that devastating phone call seemed like a different person entirely. The foundation now employed over 300 researchers, patient advocates, and support staff across 6 countries. They had treated nearly 50,000 patients with previously suppressed therapies, saved an estimated 30,000 lives, and exposed medical fraud totaling over $60 billion in stolen research and inflated treatment costs. But for Madison, the most meaningful measure of success remained personal: the letters from patients and families whose lives had been transformed by her father's work. Each thank you note, each photo of a patient celebrating a milestone they thought they'd never reach, each story of a family staying together because a loved one could be cured rather than just treated. These were the victories that made every challenge worthwhile. Standing in her father's laboratory 27 years after his death, surrounded by researchers working to fulfill his vision of compassionate medical care, Madison Hartwell knew that she had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into something beautiful and life-giving. The virgin bride who had discovered her husband's betrayal through an overheard phone call had become a warrior for truth, a champion for the vulnerable, and living proof that the greatest victories come not from revenge, but from choosing to use one's pain to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Her story would continue, but the ending was already written. Love had conquered hate, truth had defeated deception, and Richard Hartwell's dream of a world where medical discoveries served humanity rather than corporate greed was finally becoming reality. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.